first of all, congratulations on the book. It's out.
Thank you.
By Cambridge, and it will be available March 31st. I tweeted out the link to where viewers can find it. It's also in the description underneath the show today. So the topic is Chinese soft power, and I thought that we might start by thinking about what does soft power mean for China? How do they think of it, and how do they try to deploy it? And what do they want to do with the soft power that they managed to accumulate?
Yeah, they want to be flying around the world in a fluffy airplane. No, something more serious. But yeah, soft power for China has been a subject that's been like quite, I don't know, fascinating, but also just been intensely pursued by scholars and policymakers. And it's been kind of almost an obsession with soft power since mid-2000s. And in some ways echoing, Joseph Nye, the originator of soft power, he coined the term right in 1990, I believe. And he's very much kind of pro American power, and his whole point of soft power was to reassert America's dominance post-Cold War. And China was, in many ways learning from the US at that time. I think now maybe a little bit less so, but looking at the US as a potential example how to strengthen itself. And soft power was one of those things that Chinese government thought it was missing. It has the economic prowess, it has this kind of rise, less so militarily, but still there's some strategic military rise in the region. And of course, economic power primarily is what defines kind of China's prowess in the world, but much less so kind of attraction and cultural power and just the idea of being sort of a desirable nation beyond just its economy. So I think that's something that the government has been very concerned about raising and in some ways kind of softening its economic rise, right? So that's what a lot of Chinese scholars explain to me. It's not so much something very specific, but the notion that, its economic rise is often feared around the world, especially in the West. So how do you soften that rise? How do you kind of soften the edges of this, major power coming out there? You need something that relates to, public opinion, something that kind of shapes perception, something that explains China's mission, something that makes it seem less threatening. That's why soft power became so significant. So that was taken on in around mid-2000s, but then a lot of writings came out, thousands of articles came out in the past decade or so, but many of them are not quite in tune with Joseph Nye, right? They admire him and they invite him for talks and so forth, and they translated his books, but they also critique the idea that hard and soft power can be separated. They kind of see it as very much fused together, and they also, they have a critical take on U.S. soft power, thinking about this as, in many ways, kind of an outcome or an outburst of its strategic, military, and economic power. So you can't really have a soft power without hard power. That's what Chinese scholars are writing about and critiquing. But also, they see the resources of soft power as very, very kind of varied and almost all-inclusive. They talk about traditional culture, ideology, they talk about history, but they also talk about economic governance. They talk about technology, its technological innovation. They talk about its political capacity, efficiency, and mobilization. So there are many, many different ways in which they think of itself as potentially attractive. And that very much differs from what Nye originally intended, which was values, foreign policy, and culture. So that's kind of the big distinction, yeah.
So one of the themes, one of the topics that you discuss in your book is the cultural dimension of Chinese soft power. And when I think of soft power from the Western perspective, the American perspective, or even the rise of countries like Japan, Korea, the global prominence, I hear culture, I think of entertainment, I think of mass media, I think of music, movies. But the Chinese notion of cultural soft power is a little different. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so one big difference is that unlike kind of Korea, Japan, right, where soft power, cultural power is often coming from the bottom up, it's sort of more organic. Like we see K-pop, we see all kinds of other cultural, expressions and products and influences. But in China, it's very much state-driven. So when it comes to culture, the state kind of defines what's the cultural export. and that culture export tends to be very much traditional culture, so kind of ancient culture, traditional culture. We think about, Confucianism as a kind of, in terms of ideals, but also, when we think about cultural experience, it's not modern at all. It's very much kind of rooted in ancient China, and Confucius Institutes in particular is kind of a manifestation of that. That are institutes that teach Chinese language and culture. The key focus is on language, but culture is, it includes like paper carving exercises and, writing characters, practicing calligraphy, dressing up in kind of ancient, imperial type costumes and enacting some of these characters, but not so much like what is modern China, right? And that's something that is also, I think, is a point of weakness, and it's a point of tension. When you ask Chinese teachers themselves and even diplomats, they would say, what is really our culture, right? So, one ironic vignette from that was when I was in Ethiopia attending Chinese Language Day. It was like the United Nations. First of all, the only people who were invited there, which also speaks to the current, conflict in Ukraine, right, were Russians and, some Ethiopians and a few, I think, others, but not so much anybody, no Western diplomats showed up. They kind of ignored the day. So you see this bunch of Russians, so kind of amused by this awkward introduction of Chinese culture. And all of it is, focused on this very traditional kind of simplistic version of, okay, we have the New Year celebrations, right? We have this kind of autumn celebration. We have this very basic kind of holidays.
This is how you use chopsticks.
Yeah, this is chopsticks, and you can win a prize if you guess what chopsticks are. You kind of get thrown some kind of a box of, some sort of
maybe the prize is also
a chopstick or
yeah.
a cup or something. Yeah, very, very like kind of, I guess expected gifts. And then as I was, coming out of this event, there was a little reception, and I spotted this guy who was standing around. He was a diplomat coming from the Chinese embassy in Addis, and he said, what is Chinese culture like? It's like we don't even know what are we supposed to present, right? Because it's like nobody in China, not nobody, but very few people are sitting there and going to a traditional tea ceremony, right? So it's like nobody's drinking tea from this, traditional sets anymore. Very few people are. Many people drink coffee, right? It's very westernized. Or if they do drink tea, it's like in a simple bottle with a bunch of tea leaves at the bottom of the cup, right? It's nothing as sophisticated as what they're showing. So he mentioned how it would be nice to portray contemporary culture, but what would that be, right? And the more I kind of probed into that, the more I discovered that it's just seen as more sensitive, because the limits of that are not very well defined. And if you think about like maybe less so K-pop, but just digital, whether it's film industry or other kinds of creative outputs are coming out of Japan or Korea, they touch upon a lot of sensitive themes, right? It's like corruption, environmental degradation, morality, capitalism, all kinds of different themes. I think about like
Squid Game, for instance.
Yeah, Squid Game. We don't have Squid Game coming from China. Nothing similar, right, coming out. It's a very dark, kind of fascinating show. I mean, I really enjoyed it, but it's not the kind of thing you necessarily see coming out of China today. So, a lot of it comes down to sensitivity and kind of caution. And without that caution, maybe all kinds of things will be coming out of China. I think it'd be incredible to see.
To what extent is that cultural element, that especially modern culture, film, music, things that kids like, video games, how much of Chinese hesitation or the lack of Chinese champions to go into the or masterpieces to go to offer a global audience comes from the fact that Taiwan and previously Hong Kong were competing centers that were more dynamic and less constricted by official censorship?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the lack of constraints, right? I mean, we see that, especially in Hong Kong film industry, right? It was quite successful, but then recently we see a clampdown. So again, kind of the success is very much contingent upon the space for just creating and not worrying about the repercussions, like a creative film or a show or comedy or whatever it is you're producing. When you don't have to think about those kind of boundaries, right? You can come up with something very unusual and resonating. But if you have to think about the boundaries a lot, how do you tell that story? And of course, a lot of soft power, what Chinese soft power should be about, according to Chinese officials, is telling the China story. So what is the China story, right? How do you tell that story? Because that story is fascinating, complex, contradictory, extremely dynamic, right? If you visit China, you see it's such a dynamic, breathtaking place. But you can't quite tell that story without highlighting some of the pessimistic aspects as well. It's not all like any place. It's not all, cheery or, it's not all development and success and power. There's still poverty.
It's not all harmony.
Yeah. Exactly, it's not all harmony, and that lack of harmony is what attracts people. Right? They want to see, okay, how does this work? How do those different elements fit together? How do you have, I don't know, all the single women with, great careers not finding partners or husbands, and they hire like a fake boyfriend, right, to take to their family. Like those kind of stories are fun to imagine, like a show being built around. But we don't see those shows coming out as kind of a cultural export. They're more so domestic kind of, stories that are told or, kind of showcased in certain communities, but not so much to the world because they might kind of embarrass China.
I'd like to get back to this, but there's a great question from the super chat, and I'll bundle it with some observations that I wanted to make in terms of the state media driving the coverage of events within China to international channels, in terms of the emphasis on educational exchanges, especially cultivating ties with the global South. A lot of these tactical choices that you go into detail about in your book seem like they might be continuities with the socialist outreach of the pre-reform period, or even some resonance with the Soviet Union, Pravda, TASS, and of course the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. So do you see that continuity in the methods and the messages that China uses for its outreach and the socialist legacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. It actually was raised to me as a kind of a point of reference by the director of the Russian Cultural Center in Addis Ababa, who was a very grumpy man and smoked a lot of cigarettes all day in his center, which was kind of abandoned. It was one of those historic monuments of Soviet legacy. Like nobody really went there, anymore, but they still had a center. And he mentioned how China is doing everything that we used to do, we being like the Soviet Union, this old guy who's been around for a while, doing these programs around Africa. He says, but they're doing it at a much larger scale and they're much more successful, kind of like, they're just doing everything at a huge scale. So we've done something similar, but like state mobilized kind of cultural and exchanges and engagements and, paid for trips and educational ties and very much kind of relational dynamics. You're creating relationships and affinities, emotional connections, something that, yes, Soviet Union has done quite a bit. And China has also done this under Mao. It's not something that's completely new. I mean, there have been all these foreign students and guests and coming into China, but I think, again, the scale is completely transformed, very dramatically changed. But also we see other elements of difference. For instance, if you look closely at these soft power, sort of engagements, there's so many different motivations, kind of divergent motivations for why, somebody like, meaning somebody who's enacting this kind of, who's part of this mechanisms, why are they there, right? So you see, for instance, universities in China, right, they're attracting international students, not necessarily because they see it as like, oh, we want to expand the glory of China or we want to create these relationships, but they want to make money, right? So they want to get students to come because most students from the global South, they pay fees. They're not there on scholarships. That's something I was kind of surprised by because I just assumed, okay, they're all coming on scholarships, but actually the majority don't. They come for fees, but the fees are low. So they want to make money from foreign students. They're recruiting them for economic, reasons, but also because it increases their status, as it expands their status as international kind of universities, and that makes them more attractive domestically. So there are all these very pragmatic factors that are part of this kind of soft power expansion that are not necessarily ideological or even, they have to do much with China's glory, but very much kind of economic gains, or like teachers who go to teach Chinese language and culture are often, driven by the fact that they want to further their own careers as teachers of Chinese as a second language, kind of like ESL teachers, right, for English. And so they're going there for a very particular purpose. They want to practice the skill, they want to have experience, and they're going to go back and get a particular kind of job, right? So they're not that concerned with kind of, again, China's glory, representing Chinese culture, forming these relationships. In fact, they live in very isolated compound-like settings, almost like Chinese workers work for, state-owned enterprises. They live at university campuses, kind of, dorms. They cook their own meals. They barely go out anywhere. They barely see the country whether they're in. So it's not a whole lot of real deep cultural exchange beyond the classroom. So I think that maybe that's kind of different from what I saw when I was looking at some Soviet archives. A while ago, I think a couple of years ago, I looked at some of these archives. It was a friendship association between Soviet Union and Ethiopia. And it was interesting to see just how personalized a lot of the letters were to like various students. And there was a lot of Russian representatives who learned Amharic, and they had like I think a radio station or some kind of programming going on in Amharic as opposed to, Russian or English. So they really kind of put a lot of effort into appealing to people on the ground and creating this kind of deeper bonds. Maybe that's kind of also official representation. We have to be cautious, maybe not to over idealize it, but I did find that kind of interesting. And when I met those alumni of some of these programs, they're still alive. Many of them are older now. They really feel attached to Russia today. They have a very strong connection, emotional connection, and they're almost patriotic, right, kind of towards Russia. But when you see people coming from China, they come with very mixed impressions. They enjoy it. They have all sorts of benefits, but they also are very skeptical, and they experience a lot of racial discrimination, which I guess was also the case in the Soviet period. But kind of different impressions, more critique, and maybe that's just part of being more open now. They're able to express them versus before. But there seems to be kind of this nostalgic sentiment about this Soviet experience, and again, maybe that's also kind of a memory becomes a bit deceiving over time, and you forget the negative versus positive.
Well, one distinction that I think might be real is that during the Cold War, both the United States and Russia had almost missionary type attitudes towards their international outreach. The U.S., it was the Peace Corps, which likewise go there, represent us, do good, form personal relationships. This will be the greatest experience of your life. And on the Soviet side, I'm certain that both the training and the mentality were similar. And what you're describing in terms of the pragmatic attitude of a lot of the Chinese that go from the PRC to take these opportunities internationally, or the Chinese universities that accept international students in order to claim some domestic benefits, as well as increasing their revenues. That reminded me a little of what you were saying about the organic nature of the cultural exports from Japan, the United States, Korea, where music or film or TV shows are created for market reasons because they're thought that this is going to be successful. It doesn't necessarily have that missionary cause that we want to convince people we need to be a shining light or be a beacon. And in some ways it's more authentic because you don't have the political ideology as the principal motivator. And it can be more sustainable too, because an economically fruitful relationship is one that has an incentive to continue. Or if people become fans of K-pop bands, then they'll peruse the rest of the catalog. But if it's kind of sacralized, then as part of a mission, a hearts and minds mission, then people who don't directly benefit from it may become suspicious that this is a channel for propaganda, like many of the George Soros funded Open Society Institutes across Eastern Europe. Not to say that I pass no judgment as to whether or not they were vehicles for American influence, but that was certainly one way they were received in places like Hungary, let alone Russia. And which comes back to, I think, one of the central points that you have in your book, which is how does China cultivate some kind of credibility, some kind of international trust, which would allow it to tell the China story so that it would resonate not just among Chinese, but among foreigners as well.
Yeah, the credibility factor is still very problematic, and I think it works better or maybe it's less visible in some diplomatic initiatives than others. But when it comes to media in particular, communication through state media, I think that's one aspect that's been really suffering when it comes to credibility. I mean, first of all, we know very little about how much people actually trust, or not even trust, just engage or aware of Chinese media. That's one thing we just don't have that much information about, like empirically, but we do know that there's some studies that I cover in my book that has to do with Africa and Latin America, that in regions where we would expect maybe some take up of these media outlets because they're kind of pro sort of Africa, they present this idea of unity and shared friendship, they're still not that popular. And journalists who work in like Kenya, South Africa, in relatively free environments, media environments, they don't really uptake or take on Chinese media as their key sources of international news. In Ethiopia, where the environment is much more constricted, I saw that kind of state-owned media would, cite or, kind of invoke Chinese outlets, or when it comes to China stories. But still, when you interview people, a lot of them are not aware about Chinese media that much. They still consume Western media as a global source. So the credibility is the key. Credibility, and also I think it's also has to do with boredom. It's just a lot of his stories are too positive. They're kind of it's about harmony, right? It's about the good China storytelling, and the stories are just too, they're a little too positive to consume. They don't have the drama, the conflict, the tensions, and RT is a good comparison to that. Russia Today is much more dramatic. I mean, it's a whole other issue, but it's kind of antagonistic, right? So we see that RT actually has been more popular, say, in Latin America. There's been some surveys that were done about that. So I found that to be interesting. And of course, Chinese diplomats now on Twitter, if any of you follow them, you'll see that they are very belligerent, and they're quite, quite intensely defending Chinese interests and attacking, not just defending, but attacking the U.S. and, U.S. hypocrisy, double standards, all of that. Yeah.
If you start following them, they might follow you back. Like,
yeah,
be careful.
Oh my God, yeah. Some of them followed me back. Yeah, I'm a little.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out. You can catch the live stream of This is Revolution every Tuesday through Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific Time and Saturday, 9 a.m. Pacific Time. This is Revolution.